He was the kind of man no one believed could ever truly love. Wealthy, reckless, heir to a Tuscan vineyard, and to a long line of broken hearts. But then she arrived, and turned his world upside down. Because sometimes, true love doesn't come with flowers. It comes with challenges, wounded pride, and a battle of wills no one saw coming. But before we begin this story that's about to stir your heart, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and turn on the notification bell. It helps the channel grow and brings these stories to even more people. Chaos was the only routine Lorenzo Belanti was willing to live by. When the Tuscan sun rose that morning, painting the vineyard-covered hills in gold, he was still inside a historic mansion converted into a party venue, surrounded by empty glasses, music that had long lost its rhythm, and bodies scattered across leather sofas. The open windows let in the damp scent of the vines, mixed with the sweet aroma of spilled wine on the floor. Lorenzo twirled the last glass between his fingers as if in no hurry to return to reality. At 35, he carried on his shoulders a surname that was part of the history of Italian wines, but he treated it like a burden he would rather drown in expensive labels than honor in the fields. Belanti meant tradition, respect, and generations who had treated grapes as if they were blood. To him, however, it meant nothing more than an inconvenient inheritance chaining him to a land he never wished to be a prisoner of. The world offered parties in Capri, late nights in Paris, women in every language. Why waste his youth before silent barrels and bills to pay? Lorenzo was known in Florence as the man who never arrived alone, who never left early, and who never said no to an invitation. Whether in an impeccable suit or wrinkled linen, he carried the same confidence of someone who knew life had been molded to serve him. His easy laughter, laced with cynicism, drew friends, lovers, and enemies in equal measure. And yet, once the ballroom emptied, the silence revealed what he never admitted even to himself, a void no Brunello could ever fill. That morning, Lorenzo let the glass fall onto the table, grabbed his jacket, and stepped out into the courtyard. The wind carried the strong scent of old barrels, mingling with the fresh dew still clinging to the soil. The Belanti estate was vast, but Lorenzo rarely crossed its fields. He walked a few yards, his expensive shoes already dusted over. He observed the rows of vines, some poorly tended, others suffering from lack of pruning. He knew the vineyard was in decline, that the numbers fell year after year, that the family had brought in specialists, but none of it mattered. At least that was what he told himself every time the unease crept in. He was interrupted by one of the administrators, a gray-haired man who had served him since adolescence. "Signor Belanti, the consultant arrives today." Lorenzo smirked, ironic. "The savior of the nation in spreadsheet form, is that it? The board believes we need someone to reorganize everything, and she is said to be the best." Lorenzo raised an eyebrow, the insolent smile still playing on his lips. "Best at what? Ruining my wine with technical speeches?" The administrator didn't answer. He merely offered a slight bow and withdrew, like someone already accustomed to the master's temperament. Lorenzo lingered a moment longer, the breeze ruffling his dark hair, until he laughed to himself. Let her come. He had seen dozens of technicians, enologists, and investors trying to give orders. None ever stayed long. Aurora Lamberti did not believe in improvisation when it came to wine. Her entire life had been dedicated to the discipline of extracting excellence from every fruit. At 33, she was respected in Bordeaux, recognized in Paris, and admired in Piedmont. Her name circulated among collectors as a guarantee of quality. She was meticulous, perfectionist, demanding. Nothing escaped her clinical eye, and perhaps it was precisely that precision that made her feared and secretly envied. She had been living in Florence for a few months, in an apartment of clean lines and minimalist decor. No excesses. Books organized by theme, glasses kept like relics, schedule marked down to the last minute. Aurora believed life was like wine. It required time, method, and care. She was reputed to be tough, but to her, discipline was a form of respect. Respect for work, for history, and above all, for herself. Accepting the contract with the Belanti family had been an almost personal challenge. She knew the reputation of Heir Lorenzo, libertine, chaotic, A man who treated his inheritance as nothing more than a backdrop for his extravagances. And it was precisely that contrast that intrigued her. If she could reorganize a vineyard ruled by a man like that, she would prove not only her competence, but her authority in a world where men had always been the majority. That morning, Aurora dressed with the practical elegance that defined her. Light linen trousers, a crisp white cotton shirt, a discreet trace of jasmine perfume, almost imperceptible, just for herself. She picked up her leather case where she kept reports, spreadsheets, and a field journal. She took a deep breath in front of the mirror. She knew she would face resistance, but she was ready. On her way to the vineyard, she gazed out the car window at the rolling green hills, the idyllic landscape that seemed to conceal the cracks of the estate. The scent of damp earth seeped into the vehicle. Aurora closed her eyes for a moment and remembered her childhood in Verona. Her farmer father who had taught her to respect the soil. That was what she carried with her, the belief that good wine was born not only from technique, but from an intimate relationship with the land. When she arrived at the entrance of the Belanti vineyard, the wrought iron gates stood ajar. The grandeur of the place was undeniable, yet there was an air of neglect that made her frown. Trees in need of pruning, loose stones on the path, the kind of detail Lorenzo would likely ignore. Aurora was greeted by the administrator and led to the main house. As she walked through the wood-paneled corridors, she noticed the blend of tradition and decay, portraits of ancestors, old awards, but dust gathered in the corners. It was as if the past shone brighter than the present, and then, before even seeing him, she heard the voice. And here I thought a savior would arrive with cape and sword. Turns out it's just another woman with reports under her arm. Aurora lifted her eyes and found Lorenzo Belanti leaning against the doorframe, sleeves rolled up to his forearms, tie hanging loose around his neck. His smile was slow, provocative, as if the entire hall were nothing but a stage for his entrance. His blue eyes scanned her without restraint, lingering on the details as though assessing more than a professional. Aurora didn't blink. And here I thought I'd find an heir concerned about the ruin of his own family. Turns out it's just another man trying to hide irresponsibility behind cheap charm. His smile widened. Cheap? I assure you it costs dearly. She held his gaze, unmoving. Wine is not impressed by jokes, Signor Belanti. Either we care for the land or there will be nothing left to sell. Lorenzo took 2 steps forward, closing the space between them. His scent was striking, warm, woody, a stark contrast to her discreet jasmine. You speak as if I don't know my own legacy. Not knowing would be forgivable. Disdain, however, is something else. There was a charged moment of silence. The two studied each other like duelists before the first strike. Lorenzo tilted his face, a nearly insolent smile curling on his lips. You. No, Dr. Lamberti. They say the best grapes grow under stress. Maybe it works the same with people. Aurora took a deep breath, eyes locked on his. Then let's find out. Because, Signor Belanti, I'm not the kind to back down. The air between them seemed to thicken. The tension wasn't just professional. It was something far more dangerous, something neither of them was willing to acknowledge during that first encounter. She turned on her heels, resuming her determined stride, the sharp click of her heels echoing on the old flooring. Lorenzo watched her go, a strange shiver running down his spine, not of irritation, but fascination. And Aurora, even as she maintained her rigid posture, couldn't stop the disquieting thought. She had never faced someone whose presence seemed to ignite the air around her quite like this. He smiled to himself, like someone who had just found a game worth playing. She clutched the folder closer to her body, fully aware that she had just entered the most challenging battle of her career, and neither of them knew yet that in that land marked by ancient vines, the real wine about to be born was one of provocation, desire, and danger. They say wine reveals who you are when no one is watching. But Lorenzo never had that problem. He was exactly the same creature, whether surrounded by crystal glasses or tangled in wrinkled sheets. The charm was constant, the sarcasm unshakable, hedonism a sacred principle. That night, like so many others, he was exactly where he felt most comfortable. At the epicenter of a raucous party, wrapped in luxury, loud laughter, overly bronzed bodies, and promises made only to be broken by sunrise. The terrace of Palazzo Giusti in Florence was overtaken by a private party hosted by Marco, Lorenzo's oldest friend, and perhaps the most dangerous one. Owner of a smaller vineyard but heir to a larger fortune, Marco treated life like a game where only the uninterested ever win. Next to him, Gianni, a plastic surgeon with a flair for celebrity, wielded a bottle of Prosecco like a weapon of mass seduction. Women circulated in barely their dresses with overly sweet perfumes and easy laughter. Lorenzo, sunk into a caramel leather armchair, watched it all through half-lidded eyes, glass in hand and a lazy smile on his lips. That sharp charm of his didn't need to move to work. "So, Belanti, the consultant hasn't run off yet?" Marco teased, handing him a glass of bourbon. Lorenzo laughed without even lifting his gaze. "Not yet, but she has a rare gift for hating me. It's almost poetic." Johnny stepped closer, curiosity gleaming in his pale eyes. "Is it that Aurora? The one from Bordeaux? The one they say turns down even compliments?" "That's the one." Lorenzo raised his glass. Impeccable, methodical, cold as a barrel cellar, and yet there's something there, a fire hidden beneath every precisely punctuated phrase. "Is that lust or intellectual fascination?" Marco asked, raising an eyebrow. "That's danger, and I've always had a weakness for things that could destroy me." They laughed loudly, the kind of laugh that comes from men who believe they are above consequences. But at the bottom of the glass, Lorenzo could already taste the bittersweet flavor of obsession beginning to ferment. On the other side of the terrace, two women observed the group with tilted smiles and sparkling wine in hand. One of them, a brunette, her body sculpted by surgery, crossed the room without haste, her eyes fixed on Lorenzo. She stopped behind the armchair, fingers gliding familiarly across his shoulders. "Lorenzo, you've ignored me all night. Is this your way of torturing me?" He looked up with a slow, lazy smile, like a man savoring the power he held. "I prefer more creative kinds of torture." She laughed, leaning in to whisper something in his ear, turned his face slightly, and for a second their lips almost touched, but he pulled back on purpose, taking his time, letting the desire linger in the air. "I love when you do that," she murmured, running her nails lightly along his collar. "It makes me ravenous." "Then feast with your eyes, Bella, because tonight I'm only offering visual tasting." Marco let out a loud laugh, already on his feet, dancing with a woman in a dress far too short for the Florentine winter. Gianni climbed onto a chair, raising his glass. "To our daily sins." The toast echoed across the terrace. The music grew louder, a dense, sensual beat that made the floor tremble beneath their feet. The lights, in shades of amber and wine, painted the space like a scene from an old film. And Lorenzo, that man made of charm and indifference, stood up. The brunette woman pulled him by the hand, and he led her. They moved to the center of the room, where bodies danced without restraint. He led her with the command of someone who knew exactly how to provoke without making promises. His hands knew where to touch without seeming rushed. They knew when to stop, and they knew the exact moment to start provoking again. She danced like she was naked on the inside. He danced like nothing mattered. At one point, another woman approached. Redhead, light eyes, a plunging neckline, and perfume that was far too sweet. Marco introduced her as the Norwegian, looking to invest in Chianti. She smiled at Lorenzo as if she already knew he never turned down anything that came with an accent and a tight dress. "You look bored," she said, facing him. "Because I am. And what excites men like you?" Lorenzo stepped toward her. His eyes locked on her lips and answered, "Women who don't try to impress me." She bit her lip, smiled, but he had already turned away, as if he'd lost interest in something far too easy. Back at the bar, he grabbed another glass and leaned casually, observing the scene. The sensual dancing, the stolen kisses, the whispered promises in corners, sex floating in the air like part of the night's aroma. That had always been his world. Excess, pleasure, detachment. He ruled the room as if it belonged to him. He was the host of chaos. "Are you really turning them all down tonight?" Marco asked, leaning his shoulder against Lorenzo's. Lorenzo slowly swirled his drink. His eyes wandered through the silhouettes, but his mind was still dancing with images that didn't belong to that place. "I never turn anything down. I just choose more carefully." Johnny appeared with two women draped over his shoulders, laughing loudly. That's the Belanti we know. That's when she walked in. Tall, blonde, flawless curves, golden skin, and a silver dress clinging to her body as if it had been designed for sin. She moved with the command of someone who knew all eyes were on her. And in that moment, they truly were. Lorenzo's eyes met hers like old conspirators. And when she stopped 2 steps away, he didn't say a word. He simply extended his glass, offering her the last sip. She accepted, drank like someone accepting a silent invitation, and smiled. "I don't like predictable men," she said. "Then you've come to the right place," he replied, taking the glass back without breaking eye contact. The music changed, slower, thicker with desire. He pulled her in to dance with, confidence and her body molded to his as if they'd rehearsed it across lifetimes. They danced like people undressing without hurry, like a chess match made of touch. His hands slid down her waist with a lightness that felt almost scientific. Her eyes locked on his mouth, waiting for the exact second the kiss would happen. But Lorenzo wasn't in a rush. The real pleasure was in delaying the inevitable. And when the music ended, he whispered against the curve of her neck, "Let's get out of here." She nodded without hesitation. They walked through drunk bodies, whispered promises, and loose laughter, until they disappeared through a side door that led to the East Wing bedrooms. Johnny raised his eyebrows in approval. Marco clapped the waiter on the shoulder as if to say, "Another win." The night carried on. The party grew louder. But for Lorenzo, everything had narrowed down to a dark room. The muffled pulse of distant music, the heat of that woman tangled in his sheets, her laughter soft against his throat, her legs tangled in his, her moans buried in his chest. He knew how to please. He knew when to stop. He knew when to begin again. He was an expert in pleasure and goodbyes. The body beside him was still asleep, blonde, beautiful, satisfied. Lorenzo, however, was wide awake, eyes on the ceiling, his mind spiraling in circles that led nowhere. It wasn't her fault. She was everything a night like that required. But something itched. Displaced thought. Almost like a thorn. A brief memory, or rather a recent irritation. A woman with unshakable posture, hair pinned with infuriating precision, eyes that seemed to measure his every move with invisible rulers. Aurora. He exhaled quietly as if trying to banish the name from his mind. That's all it was, provocation. She challenged him, opposed him, disarmed him. It shouldn't mean more than that. And yet, in that moment when everything around him was warmth and slow breathing, it was her who appeared. A note out of tune, discreet but impossible to ignore. He closed his eyes. Tomorrow the game would resume. And Lorenzo Belanti never backed down from a good game. The next morning Aurora was already in the fields before 7. The wind moved gently through the vines, carrying the rich scent of damp earth and freshly cut leaves. The sound of birds was interrupted only by the click of her pen on the notepad clipped to her clipboard. She was alone, just the way she preferred. It had always been that way. Solitude was a form of control. Only when no one disturbed the balance could she truly hear what the vineyard was saying. But peace never lasted long on Belanti soil. "You really work before espresso?" The voice came from behind her, deep, hoarse from sleep or whiskey, or both. Aurora didn't even turn around. "Some people have the luxury of sleeping soundly, Signor Belanti. Others carry the responsibility of saving a decaying vineyard." Lorenzo approached slowly, hands in the pockets of his dark jeans, white linen shirt unbuttoned at the collar, hair tousled with a charm he'd never admit was calculated. "Always so elegant in your insults, Dr. Lamberti." He stopped beside her. "You must rehearse in front of the mirror. And you? Do you practice that seductive, disheveled look, or does it come naturally?" He laughed genuinely. "Depends on the audience." She turned her face. Their eyes met for a moment, far too long. "There's no audience here. And yet you watch me like there is." "You're mistaken," she replied, turning back to continue the inspection. "I only observe what threatens production. Threatens or intrigues." The line lingered in the air. He knew exactly what he was doing, the tone, the closeness, just subtle enough to not be innocent. Aurora felt a chill climb the back of her neck, swift and uncomfortable. "You don't intrigue me, Signor Belanti. You delay me. And yet you can't stop weighing every word with me. Because every sentence you say feels like it's come from a locked wine cellar, dark, full of promises, and over-fermented." He laughed again, this time softer, a sound that curled around her neck like smoke. What a delicious danger you are, Aurora. She ignored it, or tried to, kept writing, scanning the vines, talking about soil acidity and hidden pests. But Lorenzo followed closely, like a shadow, wrapped in masculine scent and constant irony. You know, he said, leaning against one of the old trunks, you're like a very young Barolo, closed off, hard, full of edges. But with time, she turned sharply. If you plan to flirt by comparing me to wine, I suggest you study more enology and fewer bar smiles. He stepped closer, just one step, but it was enough for her to feel his breath in the space between them. And what if I'm more interested in what's beneath the cork than the bottle itself? Then, Signor Belanti, you'll find some bottles explode when mishandled. She turned her back before he could respond. Her brown leather boots left precise marks in the dirt trail. Lorenzo stayed behind, watching. Her flavor lingered like tannin in his mouth, bitter, dense, and addictive. That night, Aurora dined alone in the main house of the vineyard. The long table, silent. The scent of roast mingled with the aroma of old books from the next room. She ate slowly, mentally reviewing the adjustments she'd make in the coming days. Irrigation, recalibrating the press, barrel inspection. Everything required control, method, predictability. But her heart was unsettled, a kind of restlessness that didn't fit into spreadsheets. Lorenzo. He was everything she despised, and yet something about him challenged her in a way no other man ever had. He tested her, pushed her limits, unraveled what she thought she'd long since tamed. And, worse, he did it with a smile. Meanwhile, in the guest house, Lorenzo was playing poker with Marco and Gianni. There was music, drinks, two unfamiliar women dancing near the fireplace, but his eyes were wandering. You're quieter than usual, Gianni noted, collecting chips from the center of the table. That's new, Marco added. Belanti, our favorite libertine. Getting pensive? Lorenzo took a long sip of whiskey. She gets under my skin. Ah, Marco grinned. So this is serious? It's infuriating, Lorenzo said, staring into the fire. She's brilliant, cold, precise, and absolutely unbearable. Gianni laughed. Translation, you're in love. I don't fall in love. Lorenzo shot back flatly. Of course not. Marco winked. You're just thinking about her while two women pour champagne on your shirt. Lorenzo sighed, got up. I'll be back. He left the room. The sound faded behind him. The laughter, the lights, the women. But his mind was still out in the vineyard, locked in her gaze, her firm voice whispering danger disguised as insult. He passed the veranda, the midnight wind slicing into skin that was far too warm for the weather. He walked to the old deactivated barn, uncorked a bottle from the private reserve and drank straight from it. No glass, no ceremony, as if trying to wash away the taste of the night. But it was another taste that wouldn't leave. He stood there for a while, leaning against the old wooden door, staring into nothing, trying to remember why everything used to feel so much simpler, and why now everything seemed less satisfying. That night, Lorenzo went to bed late and alone. The next day, the air between them was heavier than the morning fog. They worked side by side in the tasting room, sampling blends, debating acidity, disagreeing on the final cut. Their words clashed like finely honed blades. You really prefer this batch? Aurora asked. It's unbalanced. I like wines that make people uncomfortable, like people who don't apologize for being who they are. That's not personality. That's arrogance. And arrogance, Dr. Lamberti, can be an aphrodisiac, in the right doses. She paused, glass in hand, looking at him over the rim. Do you think everything is about seduction? Not everything, but certain truths only make sense when whispered close to the skin. The silence that followed was different, dense, electric, the kind that hangs between unresolved sentences, where the urge to reply wears the mask of self-control. She straightened the papers on the table, as if that ended the matter. He watched the movement with the calm of someone who knew the game was far from over. And as night fell over Tuscany, spilling its crimson hues across the vineyards, they pulled apart, but not far enough. They didn't know it yet. But this was the beginning of a dangerous imbalance. The weekend arrived like a whispered promise among the vines. Aurora closed the binder with a soft click of relief, the aged leather cover absorbing the symbolic weight of a long week. Ever since arriving at Belanti and Figli, the hours felt longer and time more demanding. But it was a demand she knew well. She liked precision, routine, control. It was almost comfortable, almost. On the porch of the house where she was staying, the breeze carried the sweet scent of ripe grapes mixed with the earthy aroma of morning. Aurora took a sip of coffee and closed her eyes for a moment. The train to Genoa left in the late afternoon. Seeing her parents, walking the streets of her childhood, meeting up with April, it all seemed to come at the right time. A break from herself, and most of all, from him, Lorenzo. She hated how his name kept slipping into the most mundane thoughts. Like a splinter the mind tries to ignore, but the body keeps prodding. He was too handsome, too insolent, infuriatingly. Charismatic. He wore sarcasm like it was breath, and the problem was he knew it, knew the effect, knew the impact, and used it, like a maestro of his own chaos. "Going somewhere all dressed up?" one of the vineyard staff asked, passing by with a crate of bottles. "Visiting my parents," Aurora replied simply. She rarely explained more than necessary. Her emotions were like her reports, organized, timely, and, if possible, impassive. Later, in the taxi on the way to the station, the olive trees passed by like shadows of old memories. She checked her ticket, leaned her head against the seat, and took a deep breath. She felt like she needed to get away for a few days to keep her sanity intact. The vineyard was breathtaking, but it was becoming a kind of emotional minefield, and Lorenzo was the ticking bomb with a lazy smile. As soon as she arrived in her hometown, the rhythm shifted. Her parents' house welcomed her with the scent of sauce on the stove and open windows. Her mother spoke loudly on the phone. Her father listened to music in the living room, and for a moment, everything felt far from the subtle chaos of Tuscany. April arrived in the late afternoon, wearing a light dress and her hair in a messy bun. Their hug was long, full of unspoken stories. "Tell me everything," April said, tossing her bag on the couch. "The vineyard, the wines, and the air." Aurora raised an eyebrow. "You're predictable. I'm curious. And you've got that look that only means one of two things. You're either smitten or about to commit a crime of passion." Aurora laughed, let out a sigh that was half amusement, half exhaustion. "He's arrogant, mocking, borderline theatrical sometimes. And on top of that, he's smart. The kind of man who wears charm like part of his wardrobe. Handsome? Very." Aurora answered too quickly, then lifted her chin, steady. "But that changes nothing. Men like him think every woman will fall for the same rehearsed lines, and maybe most do. I won't. I won't be another notch in his catalog of conquests." April looked at her for a while, serious. "What are you protecting yourself from, Aurora?" "From everything he represents. The illusion of the charming libertine, the man who thinks life is one eternal party. I've seen the damage that type leaves behind. And trust me, there's nothing charming when the lights go out." April smiled faintly, shaking her head. "Maybe. That's why he keeps provoking you. You don't play his game." Aurora crossed her arms, staring out the window. "If he wants to play, he can look elsewhere. I have no patience for men who mistake charm for character." Aurora changed the subject, spoke about the wines, the harvest, the changes she was implementing. The next morning, walking through the old city streets, Aurora felt lighter. The stone beneath her feet, the cafes she knew by heart, the glances from old neighbors. Everything smelled like belonging. But even that wasn't enough to keep certain memories at bay. That night, lying in the bed of her youth, with the same books on the shelf and the streetlights filtering through the linen curtains, she thought of Lorenzo, of his gaze, of the lazy way he smiled, of how he seemed to challenge her even in silence. The problem wasn't him. The problem was how much he unsettled her. That same night, the vineyard seemed to have been swallowed by a private party. Lights flickered over the cobblestones of the inner courtyard, while laughter echoed like the notes of a disjointed symphony. Lorenzo was in his natural habitat, white shirt with the top buttons undone, leather bracelets around his wrist, glass in hand. The music pulsed and the women danced as if they were part of a decor designed to please him, and in many cases, they were. Will the Ice Queen consultant hear about this? Marco asked, handing over another glass. She wouldn't know even if I recorded it, Lorenzo replied, his gaze following a blonde who danced like she already knew the way to his suite. Johnny walked up, crooked smile in place, pressing a kiss to the neck of a brunette by his side. You're obsessed with her. You should just admit it. Obsessed. Lorenzo laughed. No, I'm bored, and she has the rare talent of making me feel anything but. A toast to distraction, then. Marco raised his glass. The hours blurred. Laughter, touches, kisses. A succession of immediate sensations that were starting to feel too much like all the previous ones. Lorenzo was having fun, of course. He danced with one woman, kissed another, teased, whispered, disappeared and reappeared with a different drink. But somewhere in the middle of the night, lying next to a blonde whose name he probably wouldn't remember, staring at the old ceiling of the estate, his mind insisted on the same detail. Aurora wouldn't be there. And, worse, if she were, she wouldn't look at him like those women did. She would pierce him with a clinical gaze and dismantle him in silence. Maybe that's why he wanted so badly to provoke her, because she was still out of reach, and he hated not being able to break a pattern. 2 days later, Lorenzo's parents arrived back from their trip. Giulio, his skin still golden from the Greek sun, walked into the house whistling. Mila, elegant as ever, adjusted her earrings while complaining about a lost suitcase. And behind them came Katerina, the youngest, with the lightness of someone who never took the family's conventions seriously. So did Tuscany treat us well? Giulio asked, hugging his son. With ripe grapes and long nights, Lorenzo answered, a half smile on his lips. Mila looked around. The house is still standing? I'm surprised. That's because Aurora's here, Katerina replied, already crossing the room. I've heard plenty about her. The oenologist. The frosty French one no one can seem to please. Oh, she has fans now, Lorenzo asked, sarcastic. I like people who don't fall for square-jawed idiots. Katerina winked, already heading upstairs. Lorenzo smiled, but without humor. He knew his sister would like Aurora. The two spoke the same language, precision, irony, and a natural elegance that didn't need embellishment. And somehow, that only made the oenologist more intriguing. Maybe it was time to get closer, not out of emotion, but purely out of challenge. He was a Belanti, and if there was one thing he knew how to do, it was to tear down walls, with charm, persistence, and just a touch of sweet poison. On Tuesday morning, Aurora returned to the vineyard with her hair down, and her gaze more focused than ever, or at least that's what she wanted to project. The weekend had brought her peace and confusion in unequal measure. Seeing April and her parents calmed the heart, but the mind? That one was still chewing on certain provocations with a bittersweet aftertaste. It was still early when she crossed the courtyard toward the main house. The Tuscan air felt drier, the wind warmer, as if everything around her carried a silent electricity. And maybe it did. Aurora didn't know yet, but that day would bring more than just new grape samples for analysis. As she entered, she found a young woman sitting barefoot on the stone wall near the garden, a notebook in her lap and pencil between her fingers. The girl looked up as if she'd been expecting her. You must be the famous Aurora, she said without ceremony, her accent laced with irreverence. I was warned you're a legend. Cold, demanding, and almost too French for this Tuscan heat. Aurora raised an eyebrow, surprised, but not bothered. And you must be the younger sister who talks like she's known me for years. The girl smiled, pleased. Katerina, and I think we're going to get along just fine. They studied each other for a moment. Then, as if some subterranean affinity recognized itself there, they started to talk, effortlessly, with no need to weigh their words. Katerina was a whirlwind of sharp curiosity and dry humor, a blend of poetic chaos and keen perception, as sharp as Aurora's own. They walked among the vines, commenting on the harvest, the new irrigation system, the terrible coffee at the main house. Aurora laughed, genuinely, at simple things. And, Katerina, with that way of listening with her whole body, seemed to have the rare gift of drawing out feelings where once there had only been protocol. Lorenzo's going to love hating you even more now that we're friends, she said, laughing, as she plucked a grapevine leaf and crushed it between her fingers. Aurora let a half-smile slip without confirming, but also without denying. On the other side of the estate, on the second-floor veranda, Lorenzo watched, leaning against the column, a glass of Prosecco in hand. The breeze played with the light fabric of his sister's dress. Aurora walked with the same firm, confident stride as always, but there was a glint in her eyes he hadn't yet deciphered. There was something dangerous in the scene, and beautiful. The two of them seemed made of the same raw material, stubbornness with a hint of perfume. Marco appeared behind him, holding a glass. "Don't tell me you're jealous of your sister now." "Of course not," Lorenzo replied without taking his eyes off the scene. "But maybe I should get closer to the consultant. For the sake of family harmony, you're a lost cause. I'm a work in progress, and she's a case that hasn't opened yet." That afternoon, casually, he made his way through the corridors of the technical department. A quick hi here, a need help there. He passed by Aurora's office twice without any real reason. At least not one he could justify. On the third pass, she looked up from her report. "Are you looking for something or just testing the new flooring?" "Observing the vineyard's wildlife. It's been intriguing. Careful. Some species bite." He leaned against the edge of her desk, fingertips brushing the wood like someone sizing up the terrain before making a move. "You say that as if it's a bad thing. Bites are usually warnings, not invitations." "Then warn me more clearly. Ambiguity can be fatal." Aurora closed the report and stood up. She wore khaki pants and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled. The setting sun filtered through the blinds, casting golden stripes across the floor. "Fatality requires involvement, and we both know that's not the case." Lorenzo stepped forward. "Not yet. Nor will it be," she said without hesitation. But her eyes, they didn't share the same certainty. There was no romance there, no declared desire, but there was something that challenged. And Lorenzo, who had always known how to read between silences, understood. She didn't want him there, which, of course, meant that's exactly where he'd stay. In the days that followed, Lorenzo made a point of being present more often. Lunch at the same time, walks along the same trails, opinions where none were asked. The game sharpened. He threw out lines with double meanings. She responded with biting irony, and every interaction felt like a duel disguised as a dance. Neither willing to take the first real step, yet both listening too closely to the music. "Do you tease all your employees like this?" she asked one late afternoon when he showed up beside her in the vineyard. "Only the ones who refuse to smile when I walk into the room. Wounded ego is a foolish motivation, and you are a dangerous one. I'm your wine project, nothing more. Then why does your voice haunt me every time I drink a different vintage?" Aurora paused for a second, but masked it. "Because you're self-centered enough to think everything revolves around you, and you're cold enough to pretend that bothers you." She turned on her heel and walked toward the main house without replying, but Lorenzo stayed there, watching her silhouette fade into the distance, a faint smile playing on his lips. He didn't want to win Aurora over. He wanted to unravel her. He wanted to know what tone she emitted when she took off the armor. It was ego-driven obsession. Game of mirrors. It wasn't feeling yet, it was sharp-edged curiosity. On Saturday night, another party. The courtyard of the main house lit by strands of golden lights, music playing in the background, the clinking of glasses floating through the warm Tuscan air. Aurora chose not to go. She had reports to finish, and Katerina had gone out to dinner with friends. The house was quiet, but outside, celebration pulsed like a parallel universe. Lorenzo, meanwhile, danced with a woman in a red dress and stiletto heels. She laughed loudly, said he was the most charming man at the party. He smiled back, flirted, but his eyes betrayed the weariness of repetition. He kissed her, led her, but in the middle of her laughter he turned his head and for a moment looked in the direction of the house. "Are you thinking about someone?" the woman asked, catching his distraction. "No one," he lied. Hours later, with the hallways silent and the party winding down, Lorenzo passed by the slightly open door of the office where Aurora was working. She was sitting with her back to him, typing something, her glasses slipping down her nose. The lamp cast soft shadows along the sides of her face. "You never get tired, do you?" "Oh, I do, of unexpected visits, for example." "I'm just here because I forgot my book." He lied again. She turned, arms crossed. "Bad lie. Your book's in the bar. He smiled. You've been watching me too closely. Someone has to keep quality control around here. There was a moment when neither of them spoke. He looked at her. She, steady, didn't look away. The silence was heavy but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence where two minds duel without needing words. You're more interesting than you let on, he said at last. And you're more predictable than you think. Is that a compliment? It's an observation. He laughed, took a step closer, then stopped just short. One day you'll admit you enjoy arguing with me. One day you'll admit you don't need to convince me of anything. He nodded, as if accepting the challenge, turned and left. Aurora only let the air out of her lungs when the door clicked shut. The war had begun, and they both knew it. But there was no love yet, no spoken desire. What existed between them was something older, more primal, two equal and opposing forces measuring territory, two strategists who still believed they could win without getting hurt, if only they knew. He smiled, satisfied with her reaction, but Aurora didn't even notice. She was too busy ignoring the fire he was trying to ignite, and that she, perhaps without realizing, had already started to blow on. The forecast had promised rain, and for the first time since she'd set foot on that vineyard, Aurora hoped it was right. There was something about those heavy clouds that matched the rhythm of her thoughts, and maybe even the, rhythm of her breath, which had been out of sync without any clear reason, or at least that's what she kept trying to convince herself. The week had started as usual. Reports, storage adjustments, reorganization of harvest spreadsheets, and fermentation testing with the new barrels. But none of that managed to silence the provocation sown in the previous days, as if Lorenzo's words had roots, and no matter how often she pulled them out, there was always a seed left behind, an echo, a remnant. He, in turn, seemed less flamboyant, less performative. He still walked the property as if he owned not only the land but the very light that touched it. But now the looks lingered longer. The smiles came in silence, and the words, when spoken, had the exact tone to disrupt whatever alignment Aurora had spent hours building. On Wednesday, the rain arrived. It came without asking permission, thick, steady, soaking the dry earth with the scent of rebirth. Aurora was in the storage shed, cataloging a few newly arrived boxes when the drops began to drum against the metal roof. Soon the sound became a symphony, and the sky, a dense veil of dark gray clouds. "And you didn't take the umbrella I offered." Katerina's voice came from behind her, ironic and sweet. "I thought it was overkill," Aurora replied. "The forecast is wrong more often than not, except when it says your day is about to get complicated. Then it's spot on." They laughed together. Katerina wore a light coat, her hair up in a messy bun and a small notepad in hand. She'd spent the morning in a meeting with distributors alongside her father, but always found a way to slip away and talk to Aurora, whether in the lab, among the vines, or in the technical rooms. The connection between them had been unexpected and genuine, and for Aurora, almost comforting. "Want to ride back to the house?" Katerina offered. "Or prefer to wait the rain out? I'd rather drown myself in work while it does whatever it pleases," Aurora replied, trying to sound practical. "Rain gets you wet, dries up, moves on." Katerina looked off to the side. "That sounded like something you'd say about a man." Aurora raised an eyebrow. "You've been analyzing me too much." "Just observing," she smiled. "And if I may, I think you protect yourself so fiercely because you've weathered more than one storm inside that chest." Aurora didn't answer. She grabbed a box, sorted through documents, tried to ignore what lingered in the air between them. Lorenzo was the same. Katerina went on, softer now, more thoughtful. Only he went the other way. Instead of protecting himself, he became the party. Wine, laughter, sarcasm. But deep down, it's just another kind of armor. Aurora paused mid-motion. "He doesn't seem to need any armor. He looks perfectly comfortable being him. Looks that way." Katerina nodded. "But you don't know him. Like I do. Lorenzo has a good heart," she added. "He just hasn't learned how to use it without disguise." Aurora tried to smile, but the gesture died before fully forming. Katerina, without realizing it, had already planted the seed. The rain grew heavier, and with it the sign that the day would not go as planned. At the main house of the vineyard, Part of the power began to flicker. As a precaution, staff were dismissed early. Aurora decided to stay. She said she had things to finish, but the truth was something else. She wanted silence, she wanted time. She wanted to reconnect with herself. She was sitting in the sample room reading a report in the dim light when she heard footsteps in the hallway. I thought I was the only one who liked listening to the sound of rain alone. Lorenzo's voice cut through the air with softness and a low, steady tone. She didn't look up right away, kept her eyes on the page, but her heart sped up. Without her consent. "I'm not listening, I'm working," she replied. "Two lies in one sentence," he said, stepping closer. "A record." Aurora calmly set the paper down. Only then did she look at him. He was wet. Jacket draped over his forearm, white shirt clinging to his skin in places, hair darker with raindrops. But his eyes were dry, precise, fixed on her. "Did something happen?" she asked, keeping her tone neutral. "Just the rain, and the fact that you're here alone, no umbrella, no coffee, and looking like you're carrying the weight of the world on your back. It's just another exhausting day," she said flatly. Lorenzo smiled, one of those slow smiles that started in the corner of his mouth and reached his eyes last. "Can I offer you something?" he asked, heading to the side cabinet. "Prosecco? White wine? A temporary escape? A coffee would be great," she answered, dry as ever. He grabbed 2 cups, turned on the room's portable coffee machine, and as the scent of fresh grounds began to fill the air, they both fell silent. A different kind of silence, charged, not tense, but aware. "Have you always been like this?" he asked after a while. "Like what?" "Precise, guarded, hard to read." Aurora allowed herself a short laugh. "And have you always been like this?" "Intrusive, theatrical, a little too charming for your own good?" "Only with those who spark something in me," he replied without hesitation. She turned her face, but not before he caught the faint blush rising beneath her ear. "You love what you do, don't you?" He changed his tone, lower, more serious. "I do. That's rare. People who love what they do, they tend to love in the same way, too." "What do you mean?" "With devotion, intention, hunger." Aurora swallowed hard. "You really never miss a chance to flirt, do you? You think that's what this is? Seduction? That's what it feels like." "No," he answered, stepping closer now with a cup of coffee in his hand. "Seduction is something else entirely. This," he handed her the cup, and their fingers brushed, "is just curiosity." She took the cup firmly, but her eyes stayed locked on his. Then, out of curiosity, she teased, regaining control. "How many women have passed through here? The vineyard? Your crosshairs?" He laughed, leaned back against the wall, and for the first time didn't answer with irony. He simply said, "None that ever made me question if I was aiming at the right target." Aurora looked away. Outside, the rain continued strong. The scent of coffee now mingled with the damp wood, the grapes in the air, and Lorenzo, who, even standing still, seemed to command the entire room. "Thanks for the coffee," she said, walking to the door. "Already running away? Have I done that before?" "Constantly," he said without bitterness. She glanced over her shoulder. "You don't get tired of trying?" Lorenzo smiled, but said nothing, and in that suspended moment, between a question and a cup of coffee, there was something new, nothing spoken, but everything felt. Night fell lazily over the estate. After the rain, the sky cleared, leaving behind a crisp breeze and the damp scent of the vineyards. Aurora walked silently through the hallways of the main house, mentally noting the adjustments she needed to finish before the weekend. But her mind was elsewhere, or rather on someone else. It wasn't the first time Lorenzo invaded her thoughts uninvited, but that night, something was different. He wasn't just there. He seemed to lurk in the pauses, in the unsaid phrases, in the silences she no longer knew how to disguise, and that infuriated her deeply. In the house library, Katerina waited with 2 glasses of wine and a blanket casually draped over the armchair closest to the fireplace. The room was cozy, almost hypnotic. Low lighting, the scent of old wood, the crackling of firewood, and the distant sound of crickets outside. "I thought you weren't coming," said Lorenzo's sister, handing her one of the glasses. "I almost didn't," Aurora confessed, sitting down, but I figured I deserved a break. You look like someone who forgot how to take one. I unlearned, she said, taking a sip. The wine was light, fruity, and I must admit this house doesn't help. Lorenzo? Aurora furrowed her brow. The architecture, she answered dryly. Caterina laughed. You know you can ask me anything about him, right? Why would I do that? Because he has that effect on people, especially on those who pretend not to care. Aurora held the glass between her fingers, but her gaze wavered for just a second, and Caterina noticed. I grew up watching my brother be everything you probably can't stand. Flashy, reckless, arrogant. But I also grew up watching him protect the people he loves with an almost desperate intensity. Too much intensity can destroy, Aurora said without thinking. Maybe. Caterina nodded. But sometimes it's just the way some people love, the wrong way, until they meet someone who teaches them the right one. Aurora turned her gaze toward the fire. Do you think he would change for someone? I think he's just never had a reason to, she said with a calm smile. But if he ever finds one, my brother is. The kind who loves with everything. The kind who, once he gives himself, doesn't know how to do it halfway. Aurora remained silent. The wine felt warmer going down her throat. Or maybe it was the effect of those words, planting images she wasn't ready to nurture. The next morning, the sky still carried traces of the storm, but the estate seemed more alive. Aurora spent the morning reorganizing reports from the technical department and, after lunch, went down to the testing lab. She was focused, analyzing a must sample, when she heard the door creak softly. Miss the bad coffee? She said without taking her eyes off the test tube. Almost. But I heard the company down here is better. Lorenzo walked in with a box in his hands, wearing a fitted dark gray t-shirt and an almost well-behaved smile. Almost. What's that? She asked. New labels. I wanted your opinion. She raised an eyebrow. You want my opinion? I want to make a good impression. He replied, setting the box down on the counter. Thought you could help me not look like a complete idiot in front of the foreign buyers. Aurora examined the papers. There was a well-thought-out balance of classic design and minimalist boldness. And as much as she hated to admit it, Lorenzo had good taste. These two, she set them aside. They've got personality. And this one, although pretty, feels too generic. A bit like me, then, he said, stepping closer. Pretty, but dispensable. Aurora slowly lifted her gaze to meet his. Not everything pretty needs to be useful. But it's better when it is, don't you think? She held his gaze, and for a moment, forgot about the box, the labels, the wine. All she could focus on was the closeness, his breath, how his fingers hovered near hers. One small move and they'd touch. Do you always push boundaries like this? No, he said, more softly now. Only when I feel there's a boundary begging to be tested. She stepped back, picked up the labels again, forcing herself to look unaffected. You're presenting these at next week's fair? Yes, he answered, eyes still on her. Then you'll need better arguments than charm and broad shoulders, she said, switching back to her sharp tone. He laughed, unbothered. That's why I like talking to you. Because I bring you back to reality? Because you pull me out of autopilot. This time she was the one who looked away. Late. In the afternoon, Aurora returned to the main house. Caterina was waiting to go into town and buy a few things for Saturday's dinner. But along the way, the car broke down. My dad forgot to get it checked, Caterina grumbled. I'll call for help, but… She looked at her, hesitant. Do you mind if we walk back to the house while we wait? It'll be a bit of a walk. Of course not, Aurora said. And so they went. The house was quiet. Most of the staff had already gone home. The sound of church bells from the nearby village rang faintly in the distance. Aurora decided to wait in the library, book in hand. She was sitting on the leather sofa when Lorenzo walked in. He seemed surprised to see her too. Were you abandoned? Car trouble. Caterina's handling it. Want some company? He asked, already stepping closer. I don't think I have much choice, do I? You do. Just none quite as interesting. He moved closer slowly, as if the very air between them were part of an old game. He sat in the armchair across from her but didn't lean back. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes locked on hers with a silent curiosity that felt more like a touch than a look. What are you reading? A treatise on modern winemaking, she answered without lifting her eyes from the page, though she had no idea what she'd been reading for the past 2 minutes. You really are fascinating. She raised an eyebrow without looking at him. Do you flirt even with the term spontaneous fermentation? Only when it's spoken with that mouth. She let out a dry laugh, more to break the mood than out of amusement. Careful, Belanti, that canned charm doesn't work on me. Good. I can't stand predictable women. She closed the book slowly as if finishing a patience game. Her eyes met his, and there was something new there. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't irritation. It was warmth, curiosity, or maybe just exhaustion, dressed up as surrender. What do you really want? He fell silent for a moment, then stood, circled around the coffee table, and stopped behind her armchair. Aurora followed him with her gaze, tense, unsure whether to tell him to stop or just wait to see how far he'd go. But he only rested his fingers on the back of the chair. He didn't touch her, just the worn leather, now separating the two of them by a thickness far too thin to contain what filled the air. You, nearby, challenging me, forcing me to think before I speak, something I'm not used to doing. His voice was softer now, almost husky. You throw me off balance, and I like it the way someone likes fire, even knowing it's going to burn. She stood suddenly, too fast, as if her body had betrayed everything her mind was fighting to keep intact. He didn't move, just turned his head slightly, his eyes still on hers. This isn't smart, Lorenzo. Nothing about you invites rationality. She took a deep breath, trying to keep control, but he was already there, too close, his breath warm and slow, the scent of wood and the lingering trace of coffee surrounding her. This is dangerous, she whispered, voice nearly breaking. He tilted his head, lips so close to her ear it was as if the sound was born on her skin. Dangerous sounds, beautiful coming from your mouth. Aurora closed her eyes for just a second, only one, enough for her heart to skip a beat. When she opened them, she stepped back, breaking the magnetic pull that had formed between them. Keep going like this, Belanti, and you'll end up caught in your own trap. He smiled, a slow, cutting smile, the kind that burns before it fades. Lucky me, I've always been good with mazes. She didn't reply. She didn't trust her voice. She just looked at him, for a second too long, and walked out of the room with her head held high and her blood boiling. The Tuscan heat ripened the grapes under a golden sky, but it wasn't just the vineyards that were in full transformation. In the days that followed, something began to shift, slowly and silently, between Aurora and Lorenzo. It wasn't obvious to others, but it was there, an unspoken game, a minefield of glances that lingered longer than they should, of sentences spoken in a lower tone, of touches that never actually happened, but were felt all the same. It all started with moments that, by necessity of work, became unavoidable. Technical meetings dragged on longer than required. Discussions about barrels turned into conversations about wine, which turned into provocations bordering on intimate. Sometimes they were centimeters apart, analyzing wooden joints, comparing aromas in glasses, and in those small gaps, in the almondy scent of oak, in the muffled sound of footsteps on the stone floor, in the tension that rose when they both bent down at the same time to pick up a sample. Invisible thread formed, stretched taut between them like a rope on the verge of snapping. Lorenzo never backed off. Quite the opposite. It was as if every pushback from Aurora only gave him more reason to advance. And Aurora, well, she didn't allow herself to admit how much she was starting to think about him. The way he leaned over the notes, the rolled-up sleeves revealing strong forearms, the raspy tone in his voice by the end of the day. Trivial details, she told herself. Just passing distractions. Katerina, ever observant, noticed it before Aurora even recognized it in herself. He seems more tamed around you, she remarked as they strolled through the vineyards. Less peacock, more curious wolf. Lorenzo doesn't change. He just adjusts the intensity of his performance. Katerina laughed, plucking a leaf from the vine and twirling it between her fingers. Maybe, but if one day he really falls in love, well, I think he'll turn the whole world upside down for it. He has that destructive romantic gene. Got it from Dad. Aurora raised a skeptical eyebrow. You honestly believe Lorenzo is capable of falling in love? I believe no one is immune, and sometimes all it takes is the right person at the wrong time to throw everything off balance. Aurora looked down at her feet, lightly kicking the dirt between the vines. She said nothing, but something in that sentence kept echoing in her mind. Back at the main house, Mila had begun preparations for the vineyard's annual party, a traditional event that blended the region's elite investors and sommeliers with the estate's staff. Giulio organized the wines, as excited as a boy with his favorite toy, while Mila immersed herself in aesthetic details with natural grace. She delighted in textures, aromas, floral arrangements, and decor that looked as if plucked from a Renaissance painting. When Aurora approached with reports on the new harvest phase, she was immediately swept into that parallel universe. "You are going to wear a dress, right?" Mila asked with a mischievous smile. "I intend to keep my dignity intact. Dignity and elegance aren't mutually exclusive, dear. In fact, a bit of charm never hurt anyone. Sometimes it's the very thing that saves us." Aurora gave a faint smile. She liked Mila. The woman was smart, perceptive, and saw far more than she let on. As Aurora left the house, she felt strangely light, almost like an accomplice to something she couldn't yet name. The afternoon before the party, Lorenzo showed up at the testing lab with some flimsy excuse, a pH issue in a batch of rosé. Aurora knew it was just that, an excuse, but she pretended to believe it. "You know you don't need such elaborate reasons to see me," she said, without lifting her eyes from the microscope. "I didn't come to see you. I came to see the damage," he replied, leaning against the counter beside her. "And did you find it?" "Not yet, but the view is helping me stay patient." She glanced at him, eyebrow raised. "And what if I'm the damage? Then I'll spend the rest of my life trying to fix it." It was the first time she didn't snap back immediately, and the silence that followed, filled only by the soft hum of the machines and the gentle whir of the fan, was heavy, like a violin string stretched too tight, like the second before thunder. That night, the vineyard gardens were transformed into a spectacle of warm lights, live music, and long tables laden with dishes blending tradition and elegance. Fresh grapes, figs, local cheeses, wildflowers. A setting straight out of a movie. Aurora arrived in a deep burgundy dress, light and flowing, with bare shoulders and a braided leather belt cinching her waist. Her boots were there, solid, steady, but in a more delicate version, with a thick heel. Her hair was tied in a low bun, a few loose strands framing her face. She knew she looked beautiful, but she hadn't expected Lorenzo's reaction. He saw her from a distance and for a second forgot what he was saying to a group of French sommeliers. He finished the sentence on autopilot and walked toward her, wearing that half-smile that started in the corner of his mouth and didn't stop until it reached his eyes. "Good evening, Lamberti," he said as he approached. "I thought nothing would take my breath away tonight, but here we are. And, I thought the chilled Prosecco would be enough," she countered steady. But her eyes, though serious, shone just a little brighter. "Doesn't even compare. The Prosecco only cools. You stir." Aurora ignored it, or tried to. The party went on like so many others Aurora had seen in elite circles. Carefully selected music, soft lighting, glasses always full. But there, among those centuries-old trees wrapped in golden string lights, with the scents of earth and freshly bottled wine, in the air, it all seemed to carry a promise of something more. For one night, the Belanti estate became the center of the world. Aurora moved among the guests with a glass in hand, trying to stay composed, controlled, professional. The dress hugged her figure with elegant simplicity, and the slit along her leg betrayed a side of her she rarely revealed, and that tonight showed itself even without intent. She didn't want to look for him, had no intention of doing so, but her eyes refused to obey, and they found him over and over again. Lorenzo moved as if he belonged to the party, or as if the party existed solely around him. He wore a dark suit, no tie, the collar undone, unassuming charm, dangerously effective. He chatted with the guests like a gracious host, but with the women, there was something more. He placed a hand on one's back as he said goodbye, laughed at a whisper in another's ear, danced with a third, his hand resting at the base of her spine. With a casualness that exuded intimacy, even without commitment. Aurora watched from a distance, telling herself it was just curiosity, that she was analyzing his behavior for professional reasons, as if she needed arguments to justify the disdain she felt for him. But when one of the women slid her hand to the back of his neck, fingers toying with the exposed skin, Aurora gripped her glass hard enough to make the stem crack softly. She looked away immediately, feeling a heat rise. From her stomach to her face, she poured herself more wine, as if the liquid could wash away the bitter taste of discomfort. "Aurora?" Katerina said, approaching with a gentle smile. "Everything all right?" "Of course, just a bit warm." She smiled too quickly, and drank like she was running from something. Katerina, perhaps out of tact or feminine instinct, didn't press further. She went on chatting about the party's decor, the eccentric guests, how much she loved dancing. But Aurora wasn't really listening, not fully. Her eyes wandered again, searching, and found him dancing with another woman, blonde, statuesque, laughing too loudly, her hand on his chest, their lips dangerously close. The knot in her stomach tightened. The glass trembled, but she disguised it, took a deep breath and looked up at the sky for a moment, as if it might have answers. It was pathetic. "You're not like this," she thought. "You don't feel this. You can't feel this. He's exactly everything you despise, exactly everything you've always avoided." But her body didn't lie. Her throat was dry, her skin warm, and the most persistent thought of the night was, why isn't it me with him? Lorenzo, for his part, noticed everything. With the sharpened awareness of someone who knew the game and read between the lines, he missed nothing. He saw the way her eyes hardened for a second, how her lips tightened when the blonde touched his neck, how she turned away, poured herself more wine, and pretended nothing hurt. "So she does feel something for me," he thought, and the idea set him ablaze. When he saw Aurora discreetly slip away from the main garden, walking through the vineyard path lit only by a few lanterns hung among the branches, he didn't hesitate. "Excuse me," he said to his friends, handing off his glass without a glance, and followed. She walked fast, as if trying to escape her own thoughts. The night breeze tangled the loose strands of her hair. The grapes above them looked like accomplices in a scene with no script, yet brimming with tension. "Running from the crime scene?" said Lorenzo, appearing behind her, his voice low and provoking. Aurora stopped, closed her eyes for a second, then slowly turned around. "I just needed air, and didn't like what you breathed in back there. I didn't like what I saw." He stepped closer, without hurry, as if he weren't just walking, but invading. "And what exactly did you see?" "You, being you," she said, but her voice came out rougher than she wanted. "As always, women around, easy smiles, too many hands. And that bothers you?" His eyes didn't leave hers. "Why were you watching me?" She swallowed hard. "Too late to deny. I wasn't, you just make sure you're seen." Lorenzo smiled, a slow, lethal smile. "I like being seen. By you." Aurora shivered inside, not from fear, but from knowing she was giving in, even if only in thought, and that infuriated her. "You're infuriating, and you're stunning when you're angry, but tonight..." He took another step. They were now just inches apart. "Tonight you're different. You're vulnerable, and that, Aurora, is dangerously sexy." She didn't back away, but her gaze faltered. "If you think you can play with me like you do with the others, I don't want to play with you," he said, his voice even lower now, warm, almost a confession. "I want to find out how far this war goes, and what happens when one of us surrenders." She didn't answer. He lifted his hand, slowly, brushed the side of her face with the back of his fingers. She closed her eyes, just for a second, but it was enough. "You want to kiss me?" he whispered. She took a deep breath, tense. "You're too sure of yourself." "No, I'm sure of you, and of what you've been trying to hide since the moment you arrived." "Lorenzo," she said in a warning tone, but it sounded more like a fragile plea. "Tell me you don't feel it, look into my eyes and say you don't want me, and I'll stop." She tried, but failed, and then he kissed her, not with urgency, but with intention, with restrained hunger, with lips that tested, teased, promised. She gave in for a second that felt endless, his hand at her waist, his body leaning into hers like someone finding shelter in the middle of war. and when she pushed him away, it wasn't out of disgust. It was fear of wanting again. "This can't happen," she said, breathless. "It already did," he replied, "and it's going to happen again." She turned and walked back toward the party, her steps quick, her heart screaming. But Lorenzo stayed, with her taste still on his lips, and the certainty Aurora Lamberti was no longer indifferent, and that was the beginning of everything. The kiss was still there, not on his lips, but in the body's memory, in the taste, the heat, the way her fingers had clutched his shirt before letting go. Lorenzo woke that morning with her scent etched into his thoughts. He opened his eyes slowly, his mind unraveling what he felt as if trying to find logic in chaos. There wasn't any. Aurora was chaos, an elegant storm with steady steps and eyes that didn't beg, but demanded to be noticed. And he was lost. For the first time in years, maybe the first time in his life, he was in love with a woman who didn't want him, or worse, with a woman who did, but refused to surrender. In the smaller house, away from the main estate, Aurora also woke too early. She'd slept poorly, tossing under the sheets as if the kiss still burned on her skin. And it did. The worst part was that she didn't know how to protect herself from it. After all, Lorenzo wasn't just any man. He was the boss's son, the heir to the vineyard, her employer clearly defined on paper, but he was also an emotional risk, a snake charmer disguised as an amateur winemaker, a man who knew exactly what to do with his eyes, his mouth, his presence. And she wasn't some easily impressed girl. She'd been fooled before and had sworn never again. But then came that kiss, and it didn't taste like a mistake. It tasted like truth. Lorenzo refused to see Marco that week, ignored 2 party invitations, 1 message full of innuendo, and even a "we miss your interesting life." No, he didn't want that kind of night anymore. For the first time, his idea of pleasure seemed to have changed addresses. Now it lived among the vineyards, in the possibility of running into Aurora by chance, of teasing her with a subtle remark, of watching her blush from a sharp-tongued phrase. On Tuesday, they crossed paths at the back of the lab. She was leaving. He was entering. The hallway was far too narrow for them to pretend indifference. "Aurora," he said with the calmest voice he could manage. "Belanti," she replied without stopping, though. She slowed for just a second. "Did you sleep well?" he asked. She stopped, turned around, clipboard still pressed to her chest. "Are you wishing me sweet dreams retroactively? I'm wondering if you dreamed of me." She raised an eyebrow. "I don't remember nightmares. What a shame. I'd love to be your torment." Aurora bit her lower lip but didn't smile. "You already are," and walked away, leaving Lorenzo with a dangerous smile on his lips and a certainty. He was falling. Harder for her with every passing day. At Wednesday's lunch, Mila watched her son through the window. Lorenzo was alone in the field, leather folder in hand, his eyes fixed on the vineyard as if trying to solve the world right there. Giulio approached quietly. "He's changed," Mila commented. "Changed or falling in love? Maybe both, but it's the first time I've seen our son truly quiet on the inside." Giulio slipped his arm around his wife's waist. "Aurora is strong. He needed a woman like that, and she needs to know she's not alone in this emotional battlefield." The following night, Caterina approached the winemaker with the ease of someone who knew far more than she let on. They were on the terrace, where the scent of fermenting grapes mingled with the cool night breeze. "He won't stop talking about you," she said, taking a sip of wine. Aurora frowned. "Lorenzo? Talking about me? Hard to imagine." "No, far too easy," Caterina smiled. "But he doesn't talk about you the way he talks about the others. It's not about your body, it's your mind. He just wants to win, that's all. Maybe, but I know my brother. When he's interested, he glows. He's falling, he's changing." Aurora stared into her glass with unfocused eyes. "Do you think he can change?" "I think no one ever made him want to. Until now." Aurora took her time to respond. The glass of wine turned slowly between her fingers, catching the terrace's warm light as if it too were searching for an answer. Caterina remained silent beside her, giving her space, but her curious eyes never strayed from her friend. "I don't know if I can trust men like him," Aurora finally said. "Maybe he's trying to become a different kind of man precisely because of you." Aurora smiled, but with a shadow of sadness in her eyes. She didn't respond. But that night, when she lay down to sleep, it took her a long time to drift off. Lorenzo's face kept him returning like a warmth too vivid to ignore. It wasn't just the kiss. It was the way he looked at her after, like someone seeing something for the first time and knowing they never want to lose it. In the days that followed, Aurora began to notice things. Small things. Lorenzo passing by without throwing a random flirt, just a steady, intense look, as if he were deep in thought and trying to say everything without words. The way he no longer strolled through the guests with his usual flashy charm, the absence of his noisy friends, his constant presence in the vineyard, in the lab, in the hallways, silent, but present, not like before, trying to seduce her with rehearsed lines, but as if he simply wanted to be wherever she was. On a Thursday afternoon, Aurora walked between the barrels, jotting down details about a new harvest. The sound of her own footsteps echoed through the cool air of the cellar. When she turned, she nearly bumped into Lorenzo. He was there, wearing a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, hands in his pockets, his gaze calm, and dangerously so. "Are you following me?" she asked, impatient but without conviction. He gave a faint smile, leaning against the stone wall. "I own the vineyard. Technically, I'm right where I belong. And technically, you're in my way." Lorenzo stepped forward. "Can I be more direct? You always are." "Then here it is. I like you." She raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He continued, "I like your sarcasm. I like how you pretend not to care. I like the way you look at the vines like you can feel each grape grow. And I like the way you kissed me that night." Aurora tried to stay composed, but her eyes gave her away. "This isn't a confession, Belanti. It's a trap." "No." He stepped closer. "It's a choice, and I've already made mine." They stood there, too close. The air between them seemed to hum with electricity, and this time, there was no resistance. She was the one who grabbed his shirt. He was the one who held her by the waist. The kiss didn't rush, but it held the urgency of those needing to confirm a suspicion that this was real, that the connection wasn't just chemistry, it was something more. When they pulled apart, Aurora looked at him like she was seeing him for the first time. "You really are different. Because of you." "Don't say that unless it's true. I've never meant anything more." "Then, prove it." "How?" She hesitated, then said, "Stay. Here. At the vineyard. In the routine. In the work. In presence. No parties, no masks, no disappearing acts." Lorenzo nodded slowly. "I'll stay, but only if you stay too. I was never one to run." "Then stay with me, for real." Her eyes searched his. There was something there. Not fear, not doubt, but surrender. A new territory, yes, but not hostile. And for the first time, she wanted to step into it without overthinking each move. "I'll stay," she said at last, voice steady. "But don't ask me to be less than I am." "Never," he replied, gently touching her chin. "That's exactly why I want you." That night, Aurora walked back home with her heart racing, her legs unsteady, and her thoughts spiraling. Lorenzo wasn't just the boss's son anymore. He was a man seemingly willing to break his own mold for her, and that confused her more than anything else. In the days that followed, their closeness became inevitable. They worked together. Sometimes they had lunch alone, other times with Mila and Giulio, who didn't bother to hide their enthusiasm. Caterina seemed to act like a co-conspirator too, slipping out with flimsy excuses just to leave them alone for certain tasks. But more than words, it was Lorenzo's gaze that said everything. He no longer teased with sharp words. He teased with presence, with comfortable silences, with attention, with fingers that brushed hers without hurry, like he was learning a new language, with kisses stolen between barrels and analysis sheets, with respect for the distance when she pulled away, and the warmth of his body when she didn't. On Friday, during a late afternoon break, they stood on the back porch of the estate, overlooking the vineyard in golden hues. Lorenzo held out a glass to her. "Wine from the new harvest," he said. "I thought it deserved a toast with you. Since when do you drink on the job? Since you became the best part of it." Aurora smiled, took a sip. He watched her with a glow in his eyes that blended desire, tenderness, and something new, something she'd only seen once before: vulnerability. "Lorenzo," "I'm in love with you, Aurora," he said without hesitation. She looked at him, took a deep breath. "Isn't it just desire?" "No, the desire came first, of course, but then came you, with your calm, with your strength, with your resistance. And I've never wanted someone to see me the way you do, even when you hate me." She let out a soft laugh. "I never hated you. I just protected myself. Then let me be your shelter. You speak like I'm a storm, and you speak like you don't know you've already flooded me completely." She moved closer, touched his face with a rare gentleness. "Lorenzo Belanti, I'm falling for you too, and it scares me. Then let's feel it together." And they kissed, not with the urgency of want, but with the maturity of choice. Aurora leaned against the rough wooden railing of the porch and let him come closer, his body fitting against hers like the space had always been meant for that. Lorenzo's hands slid down her back with reverence. The kiss was deep, slow, but full of promise. When they pulled away, he smiled. "So, is it official now?" She looked at him, lips still damp, eyes sparkling. "Now it's official." From that night on, they no longer hid. It wasn't public. There was no need for declarations beyond what was already seen in their eyes. But Aurora felt less afraid, and Lorenzo more at peace. The romance had become real, and at last, they were ready to live it. The scent of fresh must filled the hallways of the vineyard like a living reminder that there, among barrels and vines, time didn't simply pass, it matured. A year had gone by since Aurora and Lorenzo's first kiss, but nothing about that place had aged poorly. On the contrary, this year's harvest was the most promising of the decade. Belanti wine had won awards, international seals of excellence, and secured its place on the most refined tables across Tuscany, and part of that credit, everyone knew, carried her name. Aurora walked the corridors with a clipboard in hand, her hair swept into a messy bun and a pen between her lips. She still got lost in thought when analyzing tannins, but now, at the end of every line, there was always a silent comma for Lorenzo. He, in turn, no longer vanished from the vineyard like he used to. No more disappearing acts with Marco and Gianni to wild parties in Milan. No more late-night texts with reckless invitations. Now, Lorenzo preferred wasting time learning about secondary fermentation or coming up with excuses to sneak into the lab for a kiss in the middle of the afternoon. That Saturday, the main house was full. Giulio was grilling meat on the patio with the same enthusiasm he brought to everything, as if gathering the family was an art in itself. Mila arranged wine glasses with near-ceremonial precision. Caterina chatted animatedly with a Spanish enologist visiting the vineyard. And Lorenzo? He was watching Aurora from a distance, wearing the look of someone still wondering how he got lucky enough to have her walk into his life and stay. "You've turned into a damn romantic, brother," said Marco, appearing beside him with a glass of wine and a teasing grin. "A dangerous romantic," added Gianni. "I heard you even skipped a party in Positano just to stay home with your fiancé." "With the most beautiful fiancé in Italy," Lorenzo replied, making no effort to hide the pride in his voice. "Would you two have said no?" They laughed like teenagers. "We're just messing with you, Belanti," Marco said. "But seriously, you've changed. In a good way, really. I've never seen you so grounded, calm, even happy." "She changes me," said Lorenzo like it was the most obvious truth. "But more than that, she shows me who I've always wanted to be." Gianni raised his glass. "Then here's to her, and to the fact that we still have no idea how she puts up with you," Marco teased. They laughed again just as Aurora appeared at the doorway to the patio, her smile worth more than any clever comeback. She walked over and stopped beside Lorenzo, whispering just for him, "Are you conspiring with your friends again?" "I'm being accused of becoming a decent man," he replied, pulling her in by the waist. "Guilty, with pleasure. Let's see if you stay decent when it's my turn to choose the name for the reserve label. I already told you, you can choose everything, except the last name. That one's going to be yours too." Aurora blushed. A year into their relationship, an official engagement, a ring on her finger, promises exchanged, and still, Lorenzo had the power to undo her with the simplest words. Because they were always true. From the far end of the patio, Giulio raised his glass. A toast to the bride and groom. Everyone turned. The setting sun painted the vineyard in golden hues. There was laughter in the air, the scent of wine and rosemary, and that unmistakable feeling of belonging. Aurora laced her fingers with Lorenzo's and raised her glass. To the vineyard, to family, she said, locking eyes with the man she once swore to avoid, and to the unlikely that became our destiny. Mila stepped forward and embraced her daughter-in-law with the warmth of someone who had always known this love story would end exactly here, with love. You saved my son from himself, she said, and gave us the joy of seeing that even the most stubborn Belantes can be tamed. He tamed himself, Aurora replied. I just happened to be around when he decided to become who he truly is. And who is that, Aurora? Asked Katerina, her eyes glinting with playful curiosity. A man who doesn't run anymore. Not from love, not from me. Later that evening, when the guests had begun to say their goodbyes and the sky turned a deep cobalt blue, Lorenzo and Aurora walked together through the vineyards. He had his jacket slung over one shoulder. She walked barefoot. Did you know from the start, she asked, that I was in love with you? That all of this could happen? The vineyard, us, this, future. Lorenzo stopped, turned to face her, touched her face with gentle hands. I only knew the world felt much emptier before you arrived, and that with you, even silence tastes like good wine. And now I just want to spend the rest of my life hearing you talk about pH levels and tannins with that sparkle in your eyes. And, of course, kissing you every time you forget you're in the middle of work. Aurora laughed. You're still a Bellanti. You haven't changed that much. True, he smiled. But now I'm a Bellanti who's completely yours. They kissed under the soft lights that illuminated the path back to the house. In the distance, the vineyard buzzed with voices, music, and future promises. But between them, there was only stillness, love, and the quiet certainty that life, much like wine, only reaches its best version when you wait for the right time to open it. And they had waited. Now it was time to raise a glass. To the new, harvest, to transformative love, to the roots that dug deep into the soil and into their hearts. Because when fate decides to ferment two souls in the same barrel, there's nothing time or love can't make even more precious. So what did you think of this story? A libertine brought to his knees, a strong woman who resists, and a love born where no one expected it. If you rooted for them, sighed, and fell in love along the way, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. And share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe love can transform even the most rebellious heart? Your opinion helps the channel grow and brings these stories to people who also love a good romance.